General Robert E. Lee led the Confederate forces during America's deadliest and most divisive war. Despite numerous victories on the battlefield, he ultimately bowed to overwhelming odds.
Robert E. Lee was one of the greatest generals in world history. He ranks with Alexander, Hannibal, Napoleon, Frederick the Great. He did, in fact, in many instances, more with less than all of those people did.
Robert E. Lee was born in Virginia on January 19, 1807, to an aristocratic Virginia family. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and married Mary Custis, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington.
Once the Mexican War began, he was assigned to Winfield Scott's staff and served with great distinction there.
As a result of his exploits during the Mexican War, Lee was considered one of the most courageous, intelligent, and daring officers in the Army at the time.
After the war, Lee served as superintendent of West Point until 1855, when he left to take a cavalry position in Texas. In 1859, he was ordered to put down John Brown's slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry, which he executed in 1 hour.
At the beginning of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln asked Robert E. Lee to lead the Union forces. Robert E. Lee thought of himself first as a Virginian. He refused to do so and in fact resigned his post.
He would not take up arms against his fellow Southerners, even though he adamantly opposed secession and he viewed slavery as an evil.
He did not fight for the South until his home state of Virginia was invaded.
At 54 years old, Robert E. Lee could look back on a long, dutiful career. In 30 years, he had proved himself a capable engineer, a clever administrator, a brave soldier, a respected leader of young men, and a devoted husband and father.
He had done everything and done it well. Staff work, field command. He had actually led the contingent of Marines that put down John Brown's lead. There was nothing Lee hadn't done, and everything he had undertaken, he had performed superbly.
In 1861, people looked to Lee for what was right, and many of them sought his opinion on matters imperiling the nation. He was opposed to slavery, strongly pro-Union, and against any civil war. But above all, he remained loyal to Virginia.
It wasn't the great political interpretation of how Virginia looked at the Union. It was that Virginia really was his country, and he would go with Virginia wherever she went.
There was this sureness about Virginia and its place in American history. And when one of its sons was asked by this most dominant of all states in our early history, he answered that call.
On the night of April 19th, after Virginia quit the Union, Robert E. Lee faced the most difficult question of his life.
It was a momentous decision, a decision that kept him up all one night, pacing the floors of the Arlington mansion, weighing one against the other, wrestling with his conscience, trying to find the right decision, morally, ethically, politically, to make.
That night, Mary Custis Lee, the daughter, said that Arlington was like a place where a death had occurred. And the death they waited for was the end of a brilliant military career.
My husband has wept tears of blood over this terrible war. But as a man of honor and a Virginian, he must follow the destiny of his state. It was the severest struggle of his life to resign a commission he had held for 30 years. Mary Lee, April 20th, 1861.
With all my devotion to the Union and the feeling of loyalty and duty of an American citizen, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. I have therefore resigned my commission in the Army and save in defense of my native state, with the sincere hope that my poor services may never be needed. I hope I may never be called on to draw my sword. Robert E. Lee, April 20th, 1861.
Lee distinguished himself on the battlefield and took command of the force he named the Army of Northern Virginia in 1862.
Robert E. Lee was able to defeat George McClellan outside of Richmond in the 7 Days Battle, forcing the withdrawal of the Union Army from its positions just outside of Richmond.
In the Second Battle of Manassas in 1862 and the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863, he was dramatically outnumbered, but he was able to outmaneuver and surprise his enemy and defeat substantially larger forces.
With the Battle of Antietam and then Gettysburg in July 1863, however, the tide turned against the Confederate forces.
The fact that the war lasted as long as it did certainly is a testament to Lee's abilities as a general, given the overwhelming numbers and material that he faced coming out of the North.
By 1865, with odds too great and supplies too low, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, Virginia on April 9, 1865.
After he surrenders to Grant, he instructs his men to simply go home, not to fight a guerrilla war. He says, if you make as good citizens as you have made soldiers, then I'll have done my job.
Lee eventually became the president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, which is today Washington and Lee University. During this period of time, he did everything he could to create reconciliation between the North and South.
While still president of the college, Robert E. Lee died on October 12, 1870, in Lexington, Virginia.
Robert E. Lee today is remembered in the South as a hero, in the North perhaps as a traitor. He was a man of principle who fought for a cause he believed in.